we still have absolutely no evidence about what happens to a Stelvin closure after
Got it.
40 or 50. And so the last thing we'd want is to have some stunning vintage like 2010 or 13 or the 15 that we're going to try tonight, and suddenly find that somebody who really let it, run for 50 years suddenly found out that the polymer on the Stelvin just actually couldn't hold up for 50 years. We have no evidence that that will happen, but with something like Grange, that's the one that we won't quite.
The one thing you want to be sure. Some of the winemakers in Priorat are saying that because of the New World moving to Stelvin, there's better quality cork available for those who opt to stay with cork. There was a time when people were fighting over parcels and sources for decent cork, but it's become more of a buyer's market now, which I suppose that's one small upside. Anyway, we're 6 o'clock, so let's kick off. Everybody, I'd like you to please welcome Sam, who's going to be leading tonight's tasting. It's kind of cool being a Saturday that I can actually kick back and enjoy the wines with everybody else. Sam is Adelaide born, 20 years in the wine business with a global exposure. He's got pretty much every kind of qualification and graduation. I see you've completed part 1 of the 2 parts of MW, so that's the theory, right? For the tasting.
No, it's stage 1. I've still got all the big exams ahead of me, and I'm on a bit of a hiatus at the moment. So COVID's given me a nice excuse to defer for another year.
I see that you've worked vintage in McLaren Vale and was brand ambassador for Penfolds in Europe. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sam to walk us through these 4 wines. Thanks, Sam.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Robert. Good evening, everybody. I hope you're as excited as I am to go through what is a lovely selection of Penfolds wines tonight. So just to sort of give you a little bit of an idea of what I'll do, I've got a presentation that I'm going to share. It's very visual rich. It's not death by PowerPoint, but it's just got some tasting slides, but just some images and some maps. What I'll do is obviously go through the tasting order. We'll do the Yutana, and I'm going to jump almost immediately into the wines. I'm just going to give a sort of quick 2-minute overview of a little bit of the winemaking philosophy for Penfolds first. But what I'll do is once I've done the whites is I'll pop back out of the presentation, and if there's any questions, Robert, I don't know if you want to either sort of take them verbally or whether people pop them in the chat box, whatever's easiest, or do you want to wait till the end? Sorry, you're on mute, Rob.
Hardly ever happens that I'm quiet. Let's wait for questions at the end, because I'm running out of power on my laptop, so I'm going to have to change machines somewhere through this presentation. So let's do it that way, if that's okay.
Okay, lovely. No problems at all.
Great. Thanks.
Great. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen now and jump in. So hopefully you'll all be able to see this now. So pretty much with the 4 wines that we've got tonight, it's actually a really lovely cross-section of wines to be able to take people through. And the main reason for that is it gives us this multi-regional approach that is very, I'm not going to say unique to Penfolds, but in terms of our premium quality wines, not coming from single region or single vineyard. I think it's quite unique in the Australian wine world. But we also, with the RWT, do get to explore that idea of terroir and also that idea of a single region wine as well. So just sort of jumping into what we're looking at. So with Penfolds, we basically have 2 major styles of production, which are the single region, and that is where we're looking at things like the RWT that we're going to try tonight. But we also have our Bin 128 Coonawarra Shiraz, we have the Bin 150 Marananga, we have our Adelaide Hills Pinot Noir. So there are quite a lot of single region wines, and we do have some single vineyard wines, but as we're not tasting those tonight, I thought I wouldn't go down the rabbit hole of that. But obviously quite a lot of people will be aware of our traditional home, which is the McGill Estate. And this is a 12-acre vineyard that we do produce a 100% single vineyard Shiraz from every single year. And particularly amongst our special bins, we have things like the Block 42 vineyard, where we produce some very high-end Cabernets, but on a very, very rare occurrence. So that's sort of our single region and sub-region approach, which I think, this is where we can talk about the idea of terroir and really about trying to make certain elements of a region sing in the glass and matching those grape varietals. The other thing it allows us to do is just have a little bit more breadth in the Penfolds range, because in a good vintage under the Penfolds masthead, we can release somewhere between 35 and 40 different wines if you take into account our cellar reserve range, which do things like Sangiovese, 100% Mataro, Tempranillo, etc. So we do a lot of multi-regional, single varietal and blends, but then also the single region really allows us, particularly with a grape like Shiraz, to show that regionality. But where I think we probably have the most recognition within our wines and the most famous wines that we produce, they are the multi-regional styles. So what we find we get here with the multi-regional wines like Bin 389 and Grange is that we get much more of a stylistic template, is what Peter Gago, our chief winemaker, always refers to it as. And our winemaking philosophy revolves around this idea of consistency of style and quality across our labels every single vintage. So we're not trying to be homogenous. We're not trying to just blend things together to try and hit simplicity or volume or anything like that. What we're trying to do is to make sure that all of the Penfolds labels hold a consistency from vintage to vintage, and multi-regional sourcing very much allows us to do that. Of course, in a hot year, we can go and source more from a cooler area of the South Australia, and in a cooler year, we can of course focus on those warmer regions. So while we do have those single region and single vineyard wines, we also very much focus on these multi-regional wines. And so tonight, Yutana, arguably the most multi-regional wine we do because it covers 3 different states in the vintage that we're going to try in just a moment. But St Henri and Grange, you will see on these particular vintages, can have up to 8 or 9 different regions contributing into the blend in one given vintage. And the reason that we can have so many regions going into a single wine is that all of the selection process is done through a blind tasting. And that's the key element about this, is that we are very much looking at trying to put as much of that same character into the bottle as possible. It's not something that we are trying to put the same vineyard into the wine every single year or anything like that. So by doing a blind tasting, it allows Peter Gago and the winemaking team to identify a characteristic that shouts St Henri, and that will go into the blend, regardless of whether it's Barossa, Adelaide Hills, McLaren Vale. And this goes from Grange all the way down to Canunga Hill. So every single one of the Penfolds wines has gone through this blind tasting classification. The idea being that when it's blind, there is no internal preference. There is no winemaker who has seen a vineyard that they've worked with for 40 years and thinks that it deserves its place in Grange. It all comes down to actually what does the wine smell and taste like, structurally, what's it going to contribute to the blend? And that's something that's really important to us. Because if you have a look at the Penfolds winemaking team, Peter Gago, our chief winemaker, has worked with us for 33 years, but he still calls himself the new boy in the team because Kim Schroeter, our senior white winemaker, is on his 35th vintage, started with Penfolds at the age of 16, and Andrew Baldwin is about to tick over into his 41st vintage at Penfolds. So you've sort of got these guys who've worked with these wines in vineyards for such a long period of time that if they recognized a vineyard that they knew had 125-year-old Shiraz vines in it, you would be tempted to say that's got to go into Grange. But if you do a blind tasting, it means that the wine will only go through on quality and character. And that's really important for us. And hopefully as we do the tasting, you will see where that quality and character sits for these different labels. So the other thing I always like to do when I'm talking about our vineyards and our wines is just to show this photo. This is our Block 42 Kalimna vineyard in the Barossa Valley. These are Cabernet vines, and I know we're not having a straight Cabernet tonight, but I always show this as an example. These are the oldest continually producing Cabernet Sauvignon vines in the world. Planted in 1888, so we're now getting on to our 133rd vintage coming out of these vineyards. But it's just an example that South Australia is phylloxera free. And so we have a lot of original rootstock, a lot of original vines that have never had to be regrafted or replanted. And so when we talk about old vines going into wines like Grange, RWT, St Henri in particular, we can very easily be talking about wines familiar with Barossa Valley and the fact that they actually have an old vine charter where they will delineate vineyards into quite a lot of different age brackets, with the centenarian vines being the oldest at 100 years plus. So So what we'll do now is we'll jump into the first of the wines, but you'll all hopefully get familiar with this map by the end of the presentation, because I keep coming back to it because it really does show the length and breadth that Penfolds go to when we are setting our wines. So for the first wine that we're going to try, the 2017 Yutana, we are actually looking at a multi-regional wine that covers fruit from Tasmania, Tumbarumba up here in New South Wales, and then finally the Adelaide Hills sitting over here. And if you try to draw a line from the Adelaide Hills down to the sort of Derwent and Coal Valley here at the bottom end of South Australia, that's more than 2,000 kilometres. And if you then head north from Tasmania up to Tumbarumba, you're travelling about 1,500 kilometres. So this is a pretty big triangle and a pretty big area to cover. It is made in a volume of about 500 to 700 cases a year. So we are talking about going far and wide in terms of sourcing, but we are also talking about searching out some of the absolutely highest quality, cool climate Chardonnay that we can find. So what we get here with the different areas, if we start with the Derwent Valley and also some of the Tamar Valley that we use here in Tasmania, we are talking about latitude, giving us cool climate regions. So harvesting of Chardonnay can take place 6 to 8 weeks later than some of the earliest harvesting in the Adelaide Hills for Chardonnay. Now, that's a pretty extreme example of a cooler vintage, but what that means is down in the Derwent Valley, you get lovely hang time. You get a lot of time on the vines, but you don't lose acidity because of the latitude and the very cool climate area that you get around there. So the Derwent River opens up basically into the Great Southern Ocean, which is freezing. You don't go swimming off the coast of Tasmania very often. Very cool nights. They blow up the Derwent. They keep all of this really lovely and chilled. And even if you go to the northern part of Tasmania around Tamar, it's really not that much warmer at all. You've still got cool coastal influences that come in over the north of the island. So what we're looking at with Derwent Valley and with Tasmanian fruit is long hang time, giving us lovely ripeness, but retaining a really linear acidity. Then we go to Tumbarumba. Tumbarumba makes up sort of probably about 10 to 15% of this blend, and Tumbarumba sits in the New South Wales Highlands. It's about 20 kilometres away from Mount Kosciuszko, which is one of the ski fields that we have in Australia, and it is Australia's tallest mountain, Mount Kosciuszko, but it sits at about 2,700 metres. Tumbarumba vineyards sit 100 metres, and we actually have images of these vineyards covered in about 4 inches of snow in winter. So again, when we're talking extreme cool climate regions, Tumbarumba is very much up there. And because these are old degraded mountains, they're very mineral rich soils, what we find from Tumbarumba is we get a beautiful minerality, this really quite flinty, quite stony mineral characteristic that comes into the wines. Now, the third region that makes up Yutana is the Adelaide vintages that you were more familiar with. We're probably a little bit more rustic, a little bit richer, a little bit more body to them. That's the Adelaide Hills style. And there's probably people on the line who are familiar with our Reserve Bin A style. Now, that is quite reductive, quite punchy. I refer to it as the sort of Merceau Premier Cru out of our range. And we generally find that Adelaide Hills fruit is a little bit too powerful, a little bit too robust, generally to make up the backbone of Yutana, because we've got such pristine fruit from Tasmania, and also got that minerality coming in from Tumbarumba. So what we find is that Adelaide Hills in the last few vintages has only made up about 5 or 10%, but it does bring a really lovely rich mid-palate, a little bit of body to the Yutana. But the main thing about this wine is that lovely linear acidity that runs through it. So, and we sort of have a look at the technical note that we've got up here. It's obviously 100% Chardonnay. And if you have a look at these regions here, we're talking about 70 to 80% Tasmanian fruit, then about 10 to 15 Tumbarumba, and 10 just over of Adelaide Hills. But this can change every single year. If Tasmania had a catastrophic year, we could go back to sourcing from Tumbarumba only, or Henty, or from the Adelaide Hills as the backbone, if it gave us the right kind of character. Then the other thing that also changes most vintages, of course, is the oak maturation as well. This is a wine that has got 50% brand new French oak on it, 32% 1 year old, 18% seasoned. But we've had vintages of Yutana that have actually had 100% brand new oak. I've also seen it as low as 35%. So again, it's very much about barrel selection. It's very much about treating each parcel of fruit with the right oak regime that is going to bring out the best of that parcel. And sometimes those richer, more robust parcels can stand up to new oak. Other times, of course, it's more elegant, fresher parcels, and that's where we're going to be using the 1 year old and the seasoned oak. But the Yutana is always 100% barrel fermented. It also goes through 100% malolactic fermentation. But I think for those of you who are having a smell and a taste now, and please, don't wait on me to start trying the wines, but I think if you have a smell and a taste, in particular on the palate, you'll see it's got this beautiful backbone of acidity that just flows through the wine. And many people don't believe me when I tell them it's 100% malolactic, because a lot of people, I think, are used to Chardonnays of yesteryear that are probably a little bit more oily, a little bit more buttery. Whereas what we find here is that after malolactic fermentation, Kim Schroeter doesn't go heavy on the sulfuring. He actually won't sulfur the wines until just before bottling. And that actually allows this diacetyl, which is that butteriness, to dissolve back into the wine. Whereas if you sulfur them straight away, you really lock in that really creamy dairy characteristic. So what we really look for on the Yutana is to capture that really precise, almost malic acidity, but we still get that leasiness and that richness that the malolactic brings into the wine as well. So I'm just going to give everybody 30 seconds just to have a taste, because I'm going to do the same now. But just sort of tasting through, and hopefully just you'll see that you've got that structure on the acidity, but you've also got that quite sort of exotic fruit characteristic coming through, which comes in particular from the long hang time from Tasmania.
Sam, I think the key word is linearity. It's just resolute, right, from beginning to end. And I think there's also a marvelous textural crunch about the wine, which is really exciting and really interesting to hear that it's 100% mellow, because I would have sworn blind it's not. It doesn't have that sort of overt luci de leche kind of telltale trace with the back palate or anything like that. It's just clean and pure and precise, really gorgeous. I missed the part where you said the percentages of the three regions. Is this Tassie dominant in this instance?
It is, yep. So in the order I've got it on the list here, right, you're talking 70 to 80% Tasmanian fruit,
right?
About 10% balance with Tumbarumba just edging out Adelaide Hills in this vintage. But if we were talking about the 16, for example, we actually had about 8% Henty fruit come in from Victoria. So we actually had 4 states in the 2016 Tumbarumba. And the reason that we get that is also just to explain the process, that what we do with the Tasmanian fruit is we will crush it and we will ship the grape must over to the Barossa Valley, and it will then ferment in the same barrel hall as the Tumbarumba fruit, the Adelaide Hills fruit.
Wow.
And so that means
it's quite a logistical process, I would imagine.
Process. I mean, that's part of the expense and the labor of love that Yutana really is. To say, to go through all of this for 700 cases of wine is pretty breaking. But what that means is that Kim literally goes through and barrel selects, and particularly with Adelaide Hills fruit, he's got that luxury of going, oh wow, this barrel has actually got quite reductive, it's got quite funky, that goes to reserve bin A. This barrel has hold a really lovely malic apple crispness, that's going to help bring some vibrancy to Yutana. So
got it. Yep.
Costello Reserve Chardonnay, he's got bin 311, there's lots of other Chardonnays.
Lots of slots.
New barrel fermented Chardonnay down to Canunga Hill before. It's just gone, you know what, it's good, but it just doesn't fit anywhere. So it's going to go to Canunga Hill, and it's,
Got it.
So I think hopefully, maybe for people who haven't tried high-end Yutana before or tried high-end Penfolds Chardonnay before, that acidity, that vibrancy, that purity is something that might, give you a reason to reconsider those high-end Australian Chardonnays, because Kim will hold his hand up and say back in the mid-90s when we first created Yutana, it was pretty buttery. It was mainly Adelaide Hills fruit. There was even some stuff coming in from the top of McLaren Vale and down into Barossa, and it was just getting a bit too rich and too oily. But we've really started to chase those cool climate regions. We've really started to focus on that lovely acidic backbone that runs through the wine. And I would hand on heart say that the Yutana here is a wine that you could easily put away in your cellar or your wine fridge for 20 years without a problem. I've got a bottle of 2003 under Stelvin sitting in my wine fridge. And again, I will consider opening that sometime in the next few years. And it definitely will go down that more praline hazelnut characteristic, but we're definitely not starting to get into a sort of flabby, oily, buttery, oxidative style of Chardonnay. They're very protective winemaking, and it really maintains purity in the wines.
If it's okay, Sam, could we move to the RWT next? I'm mindful that some people have got only an hour with us.
No problems at all. So, yep, let's move on into the reds. And here with the RWT, of course, we are now going to focus in on the Barossa Valley. So sitting up to the north here at the Adelaide Hills. And this is the one region where I'm sort of going to delve a little bit more in depth, just because Barossa Valley is actually the cornerstone of the three reds that we're going to try. So why we're tasting the RWT, which is 100% Barossa, you can also think about everything I'm talking about in relation to St Henri and Grange as well. So Barossa Valley is probably one of the most geologically diverse regions in not just South Australia, but Australia itself. The area that we call the Barossa Valley, that smaller GI outside of the wider Barossa region, is about 40 kilometres from north to south and about 20 kilometres across at its widest point. So it comes out of the sort of tail end of the Adelaide Hills. So the Adelaide Hills will attach the Barossa Valley here. They'll flow up into the Adelaide Hills. They will then go across the back of Adelaide and down into McLaren Vale. So you actually have this one run from McLaren Vale through to the Barossa Valley. And for anybody who's got a nice sports car, it's one of the nicest drives you can do, is actually McLaren Vale to Barossa. Just don't stop at too many wineries on the way. But the reason I love to just go into a little bit of depth on the Barossa is just to show you how diverse the soils are. And within that 40 kilometre by 20 kilometre cross I just showed you there, you've actually got a cross section of almost every single soil that South Australia has got to offer. If we start in the north, which is here the Kalimna vineyard, you can see it's almost like walking on the beach when you walk into areas of the Kalimna vineyard. Very sandy, very pale loam soil, and it's something that's very reflective of what you'll find in McLaren Vale. But then if you walk about 3 kilometres down the road to what we call the golf course block, you start to see the sands darkening up, and all of a sudden you start to see a lot more clay coming into the soil itself. Then about 5K down the road, you're sort of getting into the central area of Barossa now. That's where Canunga Hill is. And suddenly you're talking about quite a deep mottled clay coming in. You're starting to get quite a lot more of that ferrous character, that red iron note, which is what generally turns the clay that red colour. And so you're starting to see a much denser clay-based soil, retains moisture. It's still quite free draining, but obviously not as free draining as the sandy soils you'll get in Kalimna. And finally, if you go to Marananga, that sits in the middle of the southern end of the Barossa Valley, this is a sub-region of incredible density and richness. But here you can see you've got very dark clay, and the Marananga Shiraz in particular tends to have a meatiness and an earthiness to it. So if I was just to sort of try and pin characteristics to the soil types, what you'll find is Kalimna probably brings a little bit more of the vibrancy, that black fruit note. Your golf course block is probably adding a little bit more spice, a little bit more of that pepperiness to the wine. Canunga Hill is where you start to get that really lovely licorice and almost sweet spice characteristic. And then Marananga is where you tend to get quite a lot of earthiness, quite a lot of meatiness and richness coming through. Now, for something like RWT, we probably find that we pull most of our wines from the golf course Canunga Hill style soils, because those are the ones that are most aromatic. And the one thing I absolutely love about RWT is that it is one of the most aromatic and almost floral expressions of Shiraz that comes out of the Penfolds range. So here, these are those kind of south central vineyards. You can start to see the darkness of the soil here. But the other thing I show here is Barossa is pretty flat. There's many areas of Barossa that you could almost roll a marble all the way across a vineyard, because you don't get too many undulations. And as a result, you can get big vineyards that have got quite consistent ripening and characteristics. So as a result, we know there are some pretty big but old vine vineyards in those south central areas that very often go into RWT. So again, first thing that I always say about these wines is you just look at the depth of colour. The indication that you're getting here is that you're talking about low yield, high quality, usually old vine fruit production where you've got a very high skin to juice ratio. And the thing that I really love about us having such small, dense bunches, small grapes, is that we get great color, we get great flavor and fruit extraction, but the tannins still are deceptively velvety. And that's one thing I really love about all of our reds. And we are trying, new release or younger release wines, but I do genuinely believe they are all drinkable on release, because we haven't tried to overwork the skins. We are just naturally getting such a lovely color and depth of aroma and flavor coming out of them. So if we all just have a smell and a taste of the RWT, the 16 that we've got here, For me, the thing that I really love about this is you start to get this quite blue fruit characteristic. There's quite a lot of that blueberry note to it. It's definitely got some blackberry generosity to it. But the other thing I really love about RWT is there's this almost violet or lavender floral characteristic that comes through on the wine as well. And those floral aromatics are what very much lend it to this idea of French. So RWT was created in the mid-1990s as a foil to Grange, because we were finding many A-grade, A1 parcels of Shiraz that just were not the right character for Grange. Usually too aromatic, maybe a bit too elegant, and wouldn't suit 100% brand new American oak, which is the one consistent thing about Grange, is that 100% brand new American oak. So, of course, John Duval and Peter at the time, as one of the senior winemakers, were saying, well, what can we do with these great examples of these high-quality aromatic Shiraz parcels? Let's create 100% French oak version of Shiraz, and that is what led to RWT. Known as the Red Winemaking Trial, that is what the three letters stand for, and it has very much always stood side by side with Grange in terms of, I think, its complexity. It is a more elegant expression of Shiraz, and obviously for those who've got multiple glasses, when we get onto the Shiraz, I'll say make sure you leave some RWT in the glass to go back and really see that difference between French and American oak. But again, I'll leave everybody 30 seconds just to have a smell and a taste of the RWT, and hopefully you'll start to see that evocative floral note, blue fruit core, and then that lovely toasty graphite French oak characteristic.
It's interesting, Sam. There seems to be a tell with RWT in terms of the texture. It has this chewiness about it that differentiates it quite clearly from the St Henri and the Grange. Is that a function purely of the oak treatment, or is this a question of terroir, greater definition of terroir?
All out on it. I think you're right. There is a little bit more density to the tannins, and I think probably what that might be is maybe more the vineyard regions of the Barossa that we're sourcing from, bringing a bit more of that spice, probably results in a little bit more working of the grapes. And I'm not saying overworking, because there's nothing green about those tannins, but you're right, there is just a bit more texture, particularly when we compare it to, say, the St Henri that's got no oak treatment to it whatsoever. But also, if you look at the proportion of new oak on this vintage in particular, 72%, that's high for RWT. We're not
I think that I snuck. It was impossible for me to avoid tasting just the smallest amount as decanting. And I think that to jump to the St Henri, the difference between the St Henri and the RWT, St Henri texturally shows a certain glossiness, a certain fluidity, whereas the RWT has this denser component. And in a blind, I dare say that probably would be the marker for me between the two from a texture.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think the one thing about RWT that I very often say, particularly when it's young, is that the fruit is there at the core, but it really is being adorned with the fore a bit more. You've got a bit more pepperiness. There's just a little bit more, not heat is the wrong word, but I think that there's something apart from this is very polished core of sweet dark fruit, which St Henri has definitely got, and Grange has got much more of a sweet spice characteristic, being American oak. American oak tends to have a little bit more generosity to it in its youth, whereas there's probably a little bit more of an austereness coming through from the French oak on the RWT.
Yeah.
Can I just ask a quick question, if you don't mind, Rob?
Yeah, geez, jump in, mate.
Yeah, hi Sam, sorry.
What we could do,
I'm really curious about the blending process. So you talk about multi-regional and different vineyards. Are they all owned and controlled by Penfolds, or do you also source from third-party growers as well? And how is that process undertaken, and how do you manage the quality?
So very good question. So the answer is it's about 50-50. So Penfolds own about 2,500 hectares of vineyards across South Australia. Our total sourcing would probably come from about, about 2,500 grower owned and controlled. Some of these growers, though, we are actually entering our 4th generation of relationships with these families. So I know in the Grange coming up, just to sort of jump through to tell you, we've got some Eden Valley fruit in the Grange coming through, and that comes from most of it comes from a vineyard called 16, when we then actually went out and pulled out a pretty hefty check and bought it off the family who had owned it. But we've been sourcing fruit from there. We've actually got our first record of taking fruit from this vineyard back in the 1940s. There is a Barossa vineyard called the Gersh vineyard that sits right next to our own Kalimna vineyard. The first time we ever got fruit from there was 1922, and that's recorded. So we probably got it beforehand. So in terms of quality control, the best way to talk about that is that we pay for quality. So we will give you a base rate per tonne for Shiraz. We'll say if you give us Shiraz, you are going to get $2,500 per tonne, as an example. If you make it into Grange, you are going to receive a bonus per tonne of fruit. And for Grange, you're talking about $10,000 plus per tonne. So you can make 5 times your base rate by getting into Grange, 3 times for RWT, St Henri. So we go to the growers and we say the choice is very much yours. And that's why we do it blind. We don't go to a grower and say, you give us 5 tonnes of fruit. Even if you've got 120-year-old vines, we're not guaranteeing where they're going to end up. But if you do the right thing by the vintage and by your yield and everything like that, you have the best chance of that being elevated. And we've sometimes had growers say to us, you know, I've got kids' school fees coming up. I'd rather give you 20 tonne and you guarantee me just $2,000 a tonne. And if it only makes Canunga Hill, that's fine. But if they want to roll the dice, they might give us 8 tonnes. They drop the yield right down and they say, we're gunning for St Henri this year because they will make more money from 8 tonnes of St Henri fruit than they'll make from 20 tonnes of Canunga Hill fruit. But it's a gamble. And it all comes through that blind tasting. And we have what are called grower liaison officers, who are basically, you know, they are qualified viticulturalists. They know everything to do, but they are also, we say, you know, jokingly, they're also qualified grief counsellors, because they're the ones who have to call the families sometimes and say, I'm really sorry, but we know you thought you were going to get it in. You were convinced your fruit was great, but in the blind tasting, it made it to bin 28. So, you know, that is it. And we've got so many different sort of stratas. And we pre-grade in the vineyard as well, but we won't go and tell a grower that our winemakers think this is potential A1 fruit, because of course you're setting yourself up for a fall.
In other words.
Yeah. And there are some growers who will do, if we told them to set their vineyard on fire tomorrow because it'll make better wine, they'll go and do it. There are also others who, despite what we tell them on, you know, hands and knees saying, please, could you just do X? They'll say, no, I've done it this way for 5 generations and bugger you, I'm going to keep doing it this way. So it's amazing to kind of meet, and I've met some of these growers, and you know, some of them say 80 years of supplying fruit to Penfolds, and you go in and they know everything about all of the winemakers, and it's a family conversation. And for other people, it's very transactional, and they will just look at a spreadsheet and say, I'd rather go high ton, not low quality, but you know, not go for that reward. Or if they've got a year where they just think that it's going to be really good, then they might drop the yield. And then there's sometimes somebody hits a magical window where they actually was quite good tonnage, but they get the phone call saying, by the way, all 12 tonne made it into RWT. Those guys go and pay a big chunk off their mortgage that year. So,
thank you.
But the blind tasting is the absolute core of the quality.
Yeah, fascinating.
All right, so we move to the St Henri, Sam.
So with the St Henri, this picture that I popped up here, I always do this just to sort of show people the one absolute core difference between St Henri and the rest of the Penfolds range are the barrels. That's pretty much first and foremost. In front here, you can see 300-litre hogsheads. These would be holding either McGill Estate or Grange at the McGill cellars. Behind, you have these very large old oak barrels that will be having St Henri in them. And the St Henri oak regime will only ever be stored in barrels that are more than 50 years of age and more than 2,000 litres in capacity. And the reason for that is that we want no oak influence whatsoever on St Henri, but what we do need are large maturation vessels to allow all of the different parcels of fruit to come to and marry together. Because if you have a look here on the 2016 St Henri, we have got 6 different regions represented in St Henri. So those 6 regions are probably talking about 40 to 50 different parcels of fruit. And so of course you need time to allow those different parcels to knit together during maturation, because they are kept separate up until the maturation point. They are not co-fermented. And then of course we also want to have that gentle micro-oxygenation that those large old barrels are going to give us to help soften down the density of the wine. Because St Henri, although it does have any new oak to it, again, you look at that colour, very, very small dark berries, On the nose, I think Robert's already referenced that glossiness of fruit. I think straight away you're smelling a wine that is unencumbered by oak, as Peter Gagel always says, but it is not just a fruit bomb. It's not fruit driven. There's a lot of earthiness. There's already some slight, not tertiary, but there are some definitely secondary characteristics coming in from the terroir. And on the palate, I think this is where the elegance and the gentlemanliness of St Henri really comes out. And it is just that lovely flow of fruit into an earthiness. The spice is more about that core of, say, licorice rather than that real pepperiness that I think RWT probably possesses. But again, I'll just give people a chance just to have a taste of the St Henri. And then if you've still got your RWT, by all means, go back and just have a smell between the two, because the oak on the RWT will now really stand out on the nose.
Yeah, there's just something completely together about the St Henri. It's really delicious.
And the other thing I find as I try the wine, for me, the tannins, because they are only fruit-derived tannins, there's a real grippy but almost chalkiness to them. They're incredibly fine, the tannins. They're definitely there. And this is a vintage that will last in your cellar for 50 years. I will hand on heart tell you that, because I have tried 50-year-old St Henri, and even with no oak-derived tannin, it will go. But the tannins that we manage to extract from those old vine, low yield, small clusters of berries really allow that ageability to go. But the other thing that I love about St Henri is that linearity of acidity as well. And this is where, if you have a look here, the second biggest proportion for St Henri comes from the Adelaide Hills. Now, this is Shiraz that's probably grown on the other side of the hill to some Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. And if you go to the Adelaide Hills on a summer's morning, you can actually still get frost early on in summer in the Adelaide Hills, at a time where McLaren Vale and Barossa might be 17 degrees in the morning. You get massive differential in temperature in Adelaide Hills, and that really gives us beautiful, linear, precise acidity, which I really think is another hallmark of St Henri.
Mate, do I have my Penfolds folklore right, that at initial days, St Henri and Grange were approximately the same price?
Yes, you're right. So, you know, I mean, well, I'll have to say that back in the 1950s, when we first resurrected St Henri, so St Henri wasn't actually a Penfolds wine to start with. It was first produced by a Frenchman back in the late 1800s at a place called the Yutana cellars. He was a guy called Leon Edmond Mazur, who'd had both Burgundy and Rhone winemaking experience, wound up in South Australia and actually created a Hermitage style with large old oak barrels, very European in style. And then when Penfolds bought the Yutana cellars, a winemaker called John Devoren found some old examples of St Henri, found Leon Edmond Mazur's journals, and he resurrected St Henri. 1953 was the first experimental vintage, but the 54, 55, 56, all the way through to 1960, John Devoren was actually selling St Henri at a time where Max Schubert couldn't even give away Grange. So for the first 10 years, it actually cost more, but you're right, up until about the 70s, they were almost line priced. And I'll tell everybody now that my staff allowance goes on St Henri every single year. I think that it's still one of the secrets of the Penfolds range.
It's that cashmere softness that's just so beguiling. It's fantastic, but you know, and as you point out, it's not the oak that's speaking the tannin, it's the fruit that's speaking about the tannins, and it's such a different game when it's allowed to come through that way. It reminds me of the way the Brunello makers treat their Sangiovese, these big neutral Hungarian oak casks, and really it just coaxes the wine to life, and it starts to show that same kind of, manifest that same kind of textural gloss at a relatively early stage. It's really wonderful.
Absolutely, and I was just jumping back to this, you know, this shot here, you know, this would not be out of place if you walked into Barolo cellars or, as you say, Tuscan cellars. This idea of large foudre effectively is a very, you know, European style where they don't want new oak integration, and Tuscany is a classic example of that, whereas really only those more modern Chiantis that are starting to use a lot more new oak and smaller barrel. This is a very European style that just allows that fruit to sing. And I kind of, you know, I liken St Henri in a year like 2016, which was not overly warm. We had some rains in January and February that cooled everything down. This for me is almost something that could stand next to, you know, maybe one of those more traditional Hermitage from a hotter year that has got some ripeness. You know, then, you know, your people like Chave are not going to go over the top with oak. And so you can actually start to see more of that synergy. And for me, the other nice point between particularly the RWT and this wine is that this is now more plummy fruit. That very velvety, soft black plum character is coming through, and it is an incredibly graceful wine. And the other thing, or the last thing I'll say about St Henri before we move on, is in terms of ageability, St Henri will just age on a linear straight line. It will just develop lovely complexity and characteristics. It doesn't jump up and down with oak. You know, wines that have got new oak on them, you go to them after 5 years and maybe the oak has dropped away. You go after 10 years and it's almost like there's a tree growing out of the glass. The oak kind of does this sine wave through the flavor or the character of the wine over a long period of time. St Henri has none of that, so it just allows this lovely elegance of fruit, spice, and slightly earthy characteristics over the first 15 to 20 years. And then all of that lovely tertiary, leathery truffle notes really start to evolve.
Just to put my brash salesman's hat on for a second, we've got about 7 dozen of these left on the site at about 120 a bottle. And I couldn't endorse this more in terms of how it's showing. It's really glorious.
Absolutely.
So maybe we can go to the Bomb Diggity, the Grange. We have two, before I run out of power, we've got a couple of cases of this sitting in Adelaide. And you guys have seen the links already if this is of any interest to you. So back to you, Sam.
No problems at all, absolutely. So as St Henri and Grange are both multi-regional, the last thing I'll sort of say about the map before we jump into the wine itself is just to give you an idea of context for those who haven't gone and driven around South Australia. I'm South Australian born and bred, and I did most of my holidaying down on the Limestone Coast down here. To get from Adelaide down to the Limestone Coast is about a 4.5 hour drive. So from the Coonawarra down here to Barossa Valley or Eden Valley, the northernmost areas that we generally source from, that's about a 4 hour drive and it's about 350 kilometres. So you're going to get a lot of change, of course, in soil, but also climate. The sea temperature plays a massive difference as well. The Southern Ocean off here will be about 14 or 15 degrees coming into spring. Whereas up here in these sort of bites that come in the coastal areas around McLaren Vale, they're already getting up to 18 to 20 degrees. So actually the diurnal range, the daytime and nighttime temperature difference is massive when you are talking about McLaren Vale maritime influence versus Coonawarra Limestone Coast. And that's why we also do multi-regional blending, because Grange and St Henri will need some acidity. That's where high altitude Adelaide Hills or cool climate southern vineyards will come in. And they also need robust fruit, which is where those warmer Barossa Valley, McLaren Vale areas come into play as well. So always talk about Coonawarra because it was in the St Henri. It can go into Grange. Again, very flat, very cool. You get these very cool breezes that fly across the from the Southern Ocean across the vineyards, giving you that freshness. And the other thing that I always put the Coonawarra in before Grange is because, with the exception of 6 vintages out of 61, we've always had a little smattering of Cabernet coming into Grange, and more often than not, it will come from a cool climate region like Coonawarra or Rattenbully. But the 2015 Grange that we've got here, I think if you've done the decanting that Robert advised, I think just sticking your nose into this wine, I'm actually not going to talk for a moment. I'm just going to give everybody, 15, 20 seconds just to smell the Grange, because that spice box character is something that I think is unique to this wine. And I think the thing about Grange is that this for me is the easiest wine to pick out of a blind lineup. And I get people who like to try and trick me quite often. And if they're feeling really generous, they'll throw Grange into a blind lineup. More often than not, it's Bin 389, but Bin 389 has some synergy with Grange. But the thing that gets me about Grange every time is that amazing evocative spice box character, that kind of Chinese 5 spice of cinnamon, cardamom, clove, licorice. There's an abundance of fruit under there as well, but actually on young Grange, it's that spice box characteristic that I really find kind of gives it away almost immediately. And what a lot of that comes from is actual barrel fermentation. When we're creating wines that we think will go into Grange, and again, it's not predetermined, they still have to go through that final blind tasting, we will actually take the fermentation down to about 3 Beaumet in either stainless steel or small concrete fermenters. but we will then rack the wine off to barrel, brand new American oak at 3 Beaumet, and we will allow that fermentation to finish in barrel. And that barrel ferment is where that real cinnamon, cardamom, cloves, spice box character really comes from. And then I find you move on to kind of the core of fruit, which for Grange is very often that rich, dense black fruit. I've used prune, cassis, and it's not a prune that means it's drying out. It's just that prune of concentration, because Grange really is the most opulent, most concentrated style that we can create in any one vintage. And it really does stand out. The winemakers say the Grange parcels are actually the easiest ones to identify. It's the St Henri and the RWT that they usually wind up arguing over. But Grange just has such a unique, such an evocative and expressive character when it's young, that even coming out of barrel and doing that blind tasting, those Grange parcels set themselves apart very early on.
To use the word sexy for tannins is kind of a lazy word to use, but it's so finely detailed. It's a tapestry of texture that's so finely interwoven. You certainly have a really big hint of what's coming in years to come. It's really beautiful. And the feedback I got from clients who couldn't wait for tonight, opened a few bottles of this last night and emailed me this morning, said that they were quite surprised by how forward and accessible it is right now. So the question they had was, in terms of accessibility, how does this compare to 16 and 14 as shoulder vintages to 15?
Yeah, so with that, I'd say, so basically what you're looking at is 14 is probably the hottest of the 3 vintages, 15 sits in the middle, and 16 was the coolest. Now, I've got to say 16 I haven't tried yet because our samples haven't arrived in Singapore. That will be released in 2 weeks' time. But the beautiful thing about the Penfolds collection is that we get this crystal ball. I've been tasting 16 reds for the last 4 years. And of course, we've got the RWT and the St Henri here. And I hope you'll agree that acidity is the hallmark of these 2 wines. Now, Grange is still going to be opulent, but there's probably going to be a little bit more linearity running through the Grange, whereas I think the 15 has probably got a little bit more evocative spice. The 14, probably a little bit more density of prune and cola, if I had to kind of segment them. But yeah, they're still very much Grange, but one of them's just leaning a little bit more prune and cola fruit from the hot vintage. I love 15 because it sits right in the middle. This would be textbook Grange to me. The 16 is going to be a little bit like the 12, and that's almost like the Europhiles vintage for Grange. I think you're going to find people who just say, I love Grange, but Jesus, could they turn it down from 11 to 10? Just going to get a little bit more elegance, and that's the issue of, even though it's multi-regional, we're always going to get vintage variation. But for me, the 15 would stand alongside the 10, 8, the 4, the 98, these seminal vintages. And I sort of think, somebody said, gun to your head, last 5 years, what are the 2 vintages that you would want? It would be the 15 and it would be the 13. And that would just be because I think both of those are just so textbook about what Grange should be like in an ideal vintage. And I'd say that 15 was probably the vintage out of the last 3 that we've released. The winemakers would say, yeah, we'll take that one again any day of the week.
I always fill my boots on the 389 from some of the years. And this really reminds me of how good the texture of the 389 15 is. Was a definite tell, I guess, for the Grange release.
Absolutely, yeah. And the reason that this is released at 5 years of age, the last little anecdote I'll throw in that people might be familiar with, but I referenced Max Schubert not being able to sell a single bottle of Grange for the first 10 years he was making it. 1951 to 1960, people were trying it too young. He was getting it out of barrel, 20 months in brand new American oak was about an average. Maybe it was 16 some years, 21 the next. Yep. But we've actually got old press articles of people referring to Grange as Schubert's boot polish. We've got a wine time from the Beefsteak and Burgundy Club saying it's nothing better than a dry port and will never be. He got some pretty damning, condemnation of this wine. But the reason was that he was pulling it straight out of barrel, filtering it, putting it into the bottle. People were trying Grange at 2.5 years of age, and it was just a monster. It was, this... Yeah.
Question from the chat room for you is, in your industry, you must spend a significant amount of time studying meteorology and weather patterns. this must be a big thing in terms of deciding how you allocate blend and what you expect from vintage.
Definitely. So, I mean, the one thing I'll say about, segmenting these 5,000 hectares that we've got is that a huge amount of it is actually what's happened with the weather, where, how's it affect the vineyards. And one thing I'll say about our winemakers is that they will spend every day up until harvest walking the vineyards. So when there's a weather event, they're not sitting at McGill Estate going, oh, geez, I hope the guys in the Coonawarra dealt with that rain all right last night. Whoever's job it is to look after the Coonawarra, and the winemakers will divvy it up between the team, they will be in the car at 3 o'clock in the morning driving down to the Coonawarra so they can get there and they can walk the vineyards and they can go, we are worried that this rain's going to cause rot, or we're worried that maybe we've had a dry spell and they're starting to desiccate a bit. The winemakers know what the grapes look like on the vine. And so, yes, they are, meteorologists in terms of following everything, using heat mapping on a vineyard. But they will say that nothing is a substitute for treading the rows, just going out there and walking down the vineyards, either with our viticulturalist or the grower, and actually seeing for themselves what the weather has done to the grapes.
I'm glad you say that, Sam, because when I talk to some of the American producers, they're so into technology and, this thermometer is going to tell you how much this vine needs for water, and everything's automated and the vines don't see people and all this stuff. And I kind of think I'm a crusty old fart for saying, no, you can't beat a guy looking at his vines that he's grown for 30 years. He understands the soil and the yields. There's no replacing that human element, certainly to my generation point of view.
Absolutely. Yeah. You can't make wines via remote control, and technology has helped massively. If we talk about technology, as I say, heat mapping of a vineyard has suddenly allowed us to take a 130 hectare vineyard, which is massive. And maybe 15 years ago, we just took the top of the hill in one sweep and the bottom of the hill in another. We've now subdivided that into 9 separate plots because of heat mapping. But the winemaker will still go and walk plot 1 through to 9, and they will taste the grapes before they say, bring the pickers in or get the harvesters through it. McGill Estate is only 12 acres. It's divided into 5 separate blocks, and you can see on the to Grange in 2015, and that was only 1 block. So you're probably talking about 1 hectare went into Grange. But again, we subdivided a single vineyard into 5 separate plots just to make sure we are capturing every unique element.
Well, hopefully with the advent of AI, that's one job that will stay intact. Joanna made the point that there's a very clever dominant clover aroma in the Grange. And Joanna, yes, I completely agree. For me, that's one of the phenolics that I can always attribute to Grange. That beautiful, subtle clove. It's not overt, but it's always there in the background. And as the wine gets older, the prevalence of that brown, the clove spice personality comes through more and more. It's gorgeous and something I always look for in the wine.
Absolutely, yeah. And as I say, I think a lot of that is that barrel fermentation. It really helps lift that brown spice characteristic that comes through.
Bring it to the top. Any more questions from anybody else before we wrap things up?
Yeah, I've got a question.
Sure.
Thanks. Sam, you mentioned about the 2013 and the 2015 Grange. What kind of longevity can you expect for both those wines if they're stored correctly?
So if stored correctly, I would say that both of them have the ability to age for 60 years.
Okay.
But I always caveat that with what is your personal taste, because I always have these people to say, when's the perfect time to drink wine? If you like young Grange, drink it all in the first 5 years. But my personal preference for Grange is to catch it at the midpoint of its life. For a cool vintage, that would probably be after 15 to 20 years. For something like a 13 or a 15, I know it's going to be 25 to 35 years before it hits that midpoint of maturity that I personally love. But in terms of just absolute longevity of the wine holding together physiologically, 50 to 60 years, and that's based on the evidence that we can still open up 5 separate vintages from the 1970s, and they are all still singing. The 1955 Grange, which I've never tasted, but Peter Gago, has tasted many times, he claims is still ascending in terms of the tannin and the acid still being there. We're now talking about a 65-year-old example of of Grange at that point. So yeah, I think, you know, the 8, the 10, the 13, the 15 would be the ones that if I sort of had to, you know, sort of pick something for hopefully my great-great-grandchildren to open.
I was going to say,
it's for my sons. It's the birth year.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, birth year on that, you're absolutely safe with those. I mean, I'd say even a child born in a bad year, and I use that word very sort of, you know, very loosely, because we like to think that, you know, with multi-regional sourcing, we don't get bad vintages of Grange. We just get those that might have a shorter lifespan. I've never seen a Grange that would go less than 30 years. But yeah, for your kids, they would, you know, if you're generous enough to get them a case, then they can have it on the 18th. You know, hopefully to wet the head of your grandchildren as well when they come along. So it's, you know.
Thank you very much.
And it's not being facetious, but the whole Penfolds portfolio from bin 20 and above, making philosophy. These wines are dangerously drinkable on release, but I've got bin 28 from 1983 in my wine fridge that I've been fortunate enough to try a couple of times. And if I had a friend who was born in 1983, that would be the wine that I would pull out to sort of celebrate their, you know, their 40th birthday in 3 years' time. It's crazy how much we shock ourselves with the longevity of even these more mild bin wines, and it's just something about that selection process that goes through. But Grange really is the heart and soul in terms of longevity, and I would be stunned if those vintages didn't go 40 years at an absolute minimum.
Thank you very much.
Well, Sam, thanks so much for your time. You're cordially invited to break down the 2016 Grange when it lands in Singapore. I'm sure that everybody would be excited to take a look at that. So maybe we can figure something out. Thanks everybody for taking some time out on this Saturday. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and we'll see you next week. Thanks so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robert. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the wines. Cheers.